Hello, good evening, and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name's Hugh Stewart, and tonight we have a special programme. My guest Roger Mullin and I will shortly be discussing corruption and what harm it does to the Scottish and UK economies. So that's our big discussion topic tonight. And I'll introduce Roger after we've looked at today's daily report from Ukraine. Then we're going to quickly go over the news headlines. Then we're going to talk about a new research paper on the costs of corruption. So first of all, on day 196, these are the latest headlines from Ukraine's defence on the attack from Russia. Ukraine is considering shutting down its Russian-occupied Zaporizhia nuclear power plant for safety reasons, according to Kyiv's top nuclear safety expert, Oleg Kornikov, who also expressed concerns about the reserves of diesel fuel used for backup generators. The Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, has warned that we are facing a very grave danger as shelling continues at the Zaporizhia nuclear plant. In his first television interview since leading his expert mission to the Russian-held plant, Rafael Grossi said what was urgently needed was to establish a protection area around the perimeter of the facility. The IAEA had said its experts found extensive damage at the Russian-held Zaporizhia nuclear plant. The report also found Ukrainian staff were operating under constant high stress and pressure, where there was an increased possibility of human error. We are playing with fire as something very, very catastrophic could take place, IAEA Director Senior Grossi warned. The United Nations has called for a demilitarized zone around Zaporizhia, as we've heard. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres urged the withdrawal of Russian occupying troops and the agreement of Ukrainian forces not to move in. And he said he supported the recommendations put forward by the IAEA's Senior Grossi. Ukrainian forces have attacked the Russian-occupied eastern town of Balaklia in the Kharkiv region, senior Russian appointed officials have said. Mr. Bezanov added that if the town were lost, Russian troops in Izium would become vulnerable on the northwest flank. Luhansk regional governor Sergei Gaidai told Ukrainian television that a counter-attack is underway. Our forces have enjoyed some success. Let's leave it at that. Ukraine has claimed to have destroyed the key strategic bridge used by Russian forces in Kherson. Russia's military added that the images show significant damage to the Dariv bridge itself, as well as damage to a building near the river. A parallel Ukrainian counter-offensive is occurring in eastern and northeastern Ukraine, as well as in the south, Oleksiy Arestovych, a senior presidential advisor, has said. Vladimir Putin says that Western sanctions on Russia were short-sighted and a danger for the entire world, which he said was increasingly turning towards Asia. Putin said the way the UK chooses its leaders was far from democratic, a day after Liz Truss replaced Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia have reached an agreement in principle to restrict the entry of Russian citizens travelling from Russia or Belarus. Okay, now I'm going to quickly read over the main news headlines and then we'll turn to Roger Mullin. And let me just see if you can hear from Roger just now. Are you online and receiving me, Roger?
I hope you can hear me, Hugh.
Excellent, yes. So in a couple of minutes, we're going to look at your new paper on corruption. Could you just tell me roughly what do you and your team mean by the term corruption?
Corruption takes many forms. It could include bribery, abuse of public office, nepotism, conflicts of interest, and the thing that's common to them all is it's aimed at securing personal gain of either or power or both. So that's basically how we are treating the concept of corruption.
Right, so as I flagged up, there is a new paper which you and your team have produced on the economic costs of corruption, and we're going to be looking at that today because your paper is, I think, out today. I think today is the date of publication, isn't it? On the Bottom Line website.
Yes, it's just out a few hours ago.
Right, so we're getting that straight from the press. Okay, so we'll look at that important story in corruption and what damage it does to the body politic and to the economy. So let's look at the main news headlines. Main news headlines today. Cost of living crisis, first of all. Figures published today reveal that a further £1.3 million people will be plunged into poverty, and 4 in 10 people on universal credit had to skip meals over the summer. The SNP has blamed hunger and rising poverty on the UK government's austerity agenda. The Legatum Institute warned that poverty will rise from 13.9 million in the year 2920 up to 15.2 million by 2023, even with the energy cap freeze. Excuse me. Okay, come to that in a second. And finally, the Trussell Trust also found that more than 2 million people claiming universal credit had skipped meals across the previous 3 months to keep up with other essential costs. In Westminster today, the Parliament has met again, and Ian Blackford, the Westminster leader for the SNP, has called on the new Prime Minister to U-turn on what he called her trust tax. The SNP has called the Tory government to U-turn on plans to impose the trust tax that would see households pay the multi-million pound cost of an energy bill freeze. At Prime Minister's Questions today, Ian Blackford MP challenged Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister, to rule out what he termed the trust tax and to ensure instead that the cost of the freeze on energy bills is covered through a windfall tax on the excess profits from major companies. Following Prime Minister's Questions, the SNP Westminster leader said it would be completely unacceptable for Liz Truss to let the major companies off the hook and disproportionately pass costs onto households and small businesses. Liz Truss has pulled plans to enact a new UK Bill of Rights, telling her cabinet colleagues that she would reassess ways to deliver that agenda. The bill was a flagship policy of the sacked Justice Secretary Dominic Raab, who was a Rishi Sunak supporter. The sudden halt to the bill raises questions on how the government intends to proceed with its Rwanda deportation policy, which is in limbo after the European Court of Human Rights issued a last-minute injunction to prevent asylum seekers being sent to Rwanda. The bill, which was in the Conservative manifesto, would have given rulings by the UK Supreme Court superiority over rulings of the EHCR. I should point out that Human Rights Court has nothing to do with the European Union. Next story, the Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng met with market and city leaders this morning and set out the Prime Minister's new economic priorities. Mr Kwarteng says this includes immediate support for families and businesses, support to grow the economy, and fiscal sustainability. The Chancellor also emphasised the importance of the Bank of England getting inflation under control quickly. The SNP's education spokesperson Carol Monaghan MP has called on the new Prime Minister Truss to categorically rule out sinister education changes proposed today by a former Scottish Tory MP, Luke Graham. In today's Times, the former Ochil and South Perthshire MP and Ed McGuinness, chair of the Islington Conservatives, proposed that universities in Scotland should, as they put it, fortify our foundations of our United Kingdom. Yes, that's what he said. Repetition of the word "our," and suggested that the university research funding should be awarded accordingly. Right, the Washington Post is reporting that the FBI recovered a document describing a foreign government's nuclear capabilities during its search of Mar-a-Lago, the home of the former president. The report did not identify the foreign government named in the document. Face masks no longer recommended for social care. Social care staff and visitors are no longer being advised to wear face masks at all times under new guidance published today. The recommendation has been lifted due to a sharp drop in coronavirus infections and a reduction in the severity of any illness. And now the biggest story today is that in a statement to the Scottish Parliament, which also met again after the summer break, Deputy First Minister John Swinney warned of hard choices to prioritise spending. As he said, around £500 million in savings has been found as resources are focused on tackling what he called the harsh reality of the cost of living crisis. Mr Swinney updated the Scottish Parliament on steps being taken to meet the increased costs of public sector pay and to provide support to those who need it most while balancing the public finances. Soaring inflation means the Scottish Government's budget is now worth £1.7 billion less in real terms than it was last December. Since then, inflation has risen from around 4% to more than 10%, with possible further increases to come out next week. Mr. Swinney set out to Parliament where savings have so far been made to help pay for initiatives such as the public sector pay settlements and doubling the Fuel Insecurity Fund. He has also written to the Finance and Public Administration Committee outlining the details of reductions in planned spending made in recent weeks. The Deputy First Minister has committed to setting out the emergency budget review within 2 weeks of the UK Government budget update, which is expected later this month. He warned further intervention will represent a significant challenge given the largely fixed Scottish Government budget and its limited fiscal powers. So, Roger Mullin, thank you for waiting as we went through the news. I wonder if you have any comments on that last story. The Scottish Government, of course, will have to set an emergency budget, but they in turn cannot do that until the Chancellor Kwarteng sets his emergency budget, or whatever they're going to call it. So the Scottish Government is clearly going to be demanding an inflation increase in central government funding. What do you think the chances that's going to be forthcoming from London? We're having some problems with the internet connection tonight, and that seems to have happened again just now. So I hope we'll get Roger back online in a couple of minutes. You picking me up, Roger? I'm trying to communicate from the south side of Glasgow to Fife. Somewhere along the line, the digits have been held up. Well, I'm going to return to that when we get Roger back on again. But as I said at the start of the programme, the big discussion is happening. Right, Roger's back on. Yes, sorry, I didn't get you there, Roger. I don't know if you were hearing me, but the link froze. So I was asking about the Scottish Government's budget funding crisis. Inflation has knocked a huge amount off the government budget. What's the chances of Kwasi Kwarteng putting that money back? Okay, I hope you can see me okay, because I did have a problem just before we went on, not getting a clear link. Roger, I'm going to ask Roger if he can read you his link. It's coming and going. I just got a minute there. Right, I think I'll move on, and I hope Roger will be able to join us. As I said at the top of the programme, our main discussion tonight, a new paper from the bottom line, and I think I've got Roger back on again. So let's just move on to discuss your paper. Roger, as you outlined a few minutes ago, corruption takes many forms in public life. It could be bribery, or it could be misuse of public funds. It could be um, an opaque way of dishing out public contracts, and it could also include money laundering and many other things. So you've written a paper today with your two colleagues, or rather, you've published it today. So the bottom line, if people haven't come across you before, is yourself, Roger, plus David Simpson, the economist, and Graham Blackett, the business advisor. So the three of you have produced now your fourth paper outlining what's wrong with Scotland being part of the UK and how Scotland could do things better itself. Right, I think that's a fair summary. So
a fair summary,
the paper
Hugh.
today. Okay, so this is the fourth paper, and we have discussed the previous three, and they're all on the Bottom Line website. You can find that at thebottomline.scot on the World Wide Web. So let's look at corruption. So as Roger said at the start of the programme, it could be bribery, or it could be various other things. So let's discuss one of the big issues which is in the paper, and I've read it this afternoon. And you're talking about, well, let's look at the question of state capture. You've said that bribery and misallocation of contracts, or maybe unethical behaviour by big business, could all be aspects of corruption. But you're saying one of the things that allows it to happen is what you call state capture. What do you and your colleagues mean by that?
Right, well, basically, state capture is an idea that's been around for a good few years now. It's the idea that malign actors, whether they're criminals or corrupt politicians or corrupt business people, begin to have an overwhelming influence on the development of government policies and the like, and that their influence is born of their corrupt behaviour. And so what's happening is the state more and more is reflecting not the interests of the people it's there to serve, but is actually serving the interests of these malign actors. And when it gets to the stage that it's beginning to get to in the United Kingdom, it's right to be, in our view, to be fearful that what we're seeing is really the beginnings of state capture by influences other than those that are democratic in nature.
Now, I think we're used to hearing the kind of situations that you describe in corrupt governments, maybe in third world dictatorships or maybe even in Soviet Russia, the idea that a very small group of elites really run the state and choose the direction and the strategy of the state for themselves, thoroughly undemocratic. So, are you actually saying that in a democratic country in the West, state capture could be almost as bad as it could be in one of those unelected dictatorships?
I'm not saying it be as bad as that, but I am saying we should not ignore the fact that a creeping culture of state capture is underway. So, of course, I'm not saying it's as bad as some of the worst examples in the world, but it's of a scale that is hugely worrying. I mean, it's the scale that is of concern. For example, if you put together, according to the UK government's own National Crime Agency, if you put together the amount of money laundering together with high levels of economic crime, institutional type crime, then the cost of that every year is roughly about 5 times or more the entire annual budget of the Scottish Government. In other words, the scale of these types of corrupt actions, money laundering and the like, is huge. And they have an impact on the lives of individual people in our society. They have impact in the lives of everybody walking around the smallest town, the largest city in Scotland. And we ignore this at our peril.
So the extent of the corruption and the extent of what you term economic crime actually means that money has been taken out of the economy. That money could be used, of course, to improve the welfare of the citizens, which is what the economy and the democratic system is supposed to be doing. So you're saying that people aren't aware of the vast amount that's actually, if you like, being lifted out of the economy and taken out of circulation.
Well,
Is that what we're saying?
that, that's only part. I mean, we're not saying that, for example, not every amount of money laundering is money that's taken out of the UK economy. Some of it is we are supplying services to people who, for example, from Eastern Europe, laundering their money through the City of London, which is probably the biggest capital in the world to service ill-gotten gains of oligarchs, kleptocrats, and the like. So in part you're correct, but in part it's having this culture set up where we become the go-to place for people with ill-gotten gains. The real impact on the economy is the more corruption you get in an economy, the more it disrupts the proper operation of a market. So that the people who suffer are not just individual consumers, individuals, but it also affects honest businesses because they find it more and more difficult to compete if they're competing against people that are fueled by criminal assets and the like, or fueled by businesses that won't pay their tax. So if you're a business in Scotland and you're competing against some other business that uses these things called shell companies to hide their profits, not pay their taxes, you're creating unfairness in the system, and an unfairness in the system that penalizes honest businesses and honest individuals. And so it has a profound impact on the effective operation of an economy.
Yes, I see. You quote at the start of the document a French economist is saying something to the effect that that it spreads throughout society. If you start off with corruption and you don't deal with it, it gets worse and becomes endemic. And so you're also saying that, if you like, the bad drives out the good. It's easier to be corrupt
Well,
when it's more difficult to be not to be honest.
well, that's right. Basically, what it was eventually what is they come to power that they begin to influence or even write the laws of that society, and they begin to embed their behavior as an acceptable part of the culture of the society. And really, what we're saying is there's been far too much acceptance of culture and the way in which the system is operating at present, and we need to do something serious about it. And these things affect Scotland. Now, I accept that the Scottish government does not have the powers necessary to intervene in all these areas. That's part of the problem. If I give you extended examples in our paper about these things called Scottish limited partnerships, which I've been campaigning about for years. We're still at the situation where there are thousands of these things called Scottish limited partnerships. We don't know who owns them. We don't know who the directors are. They don't supply any information on economic activity, though they've been behind some of the biggest frauds, some of the biggest criminal activities, not just here at home, but throughout the world. You know, there were 113 Scottish limited partnerships at the forefront of what was called the Russian laundromat a good number of years ago, where lots of money by oligarchs was taken out of Russia and laundered through the UK. And very often that was done with the assistance of these things called Scottish limited partnerships. So there are many aspects that need to be sorted. The problem we have in Scotland is at the moment is that many of these things rely on action from Westminster because they are not devolved. For example, the Scottish government does not have any authority at all to deal with money laundering. And so it's very difficult for them to act. So all they can do is ask Westminster to act. And I know from my time as an MP that they're extremely reluctant to act to close down men's abuses. You ask yourself, why are they reluctant to close down many of these abuses? Well, putting it crudely, many of them in power benefit from it. And so it's this self-interest that is driving against the interests of the people as a whole. I mean, it's acting against not just the interests of people in Scotland, it's acting against the interests of people in England and Wales and Northern Ireland. The more you have this corruption at the heart of the system, and that's what we need to address.
Okay, you've brought, yes, I was going to discuss SLP, so let's just go into that in a bit more detail.
Okay.
I first became aware of this about 3 years ago reading accounts in the Herald by David Leask, and you do quote David Leask a number of times
Yeah.
in today's paper. Now, Leask and other journalists like Ian Fraser and some other journalists who you mentioned have been investigating irregularities. SLPs, in fact, have been around for a very long time, but it appears that they very recently became very trendy among people who've got a lot of hot money to shift and don't want any
Yeah,
questions to ask. So they've been around, I think,
absolutely.
for a long time. So if somebody wanted to set up a partnership, but for some reason wanted to keep it quiet, well, presumably 100 years ago, that wasn't a scene of crime. But really, at least and
Yeah.
others have been arguing, they really are being used by some very unpleasant people.
Oh, I mean, you're absolutely right. They actually started in 1907. That's when they were created in law, Scottish limited partnerships, as we call them today. But for 100 years, there was very limited numbers, and in most cases they were used for very particular circumstances by, for example, landowners and the like. But in 2008, in the wake of the financial crisis, and when people were losing lots of money, but also people were making lots of money out of it. Those that were making money out of it wanted to know, what are we going to do with our assets? How are we going to use them? And so they came across these things called Scottish limited partnerships, where they could register themselves with this thing that looks incredibly legitimate, right? They can say that they've got this partnership registered in the UK. Who's going to question that? It's available to look at in Companies House. And so suddenly these became a front for all sorts of nefarious purposes, including serious economic crime and money laundering. So that there's now, when I was talking with probably the doyen of researchers in this field is a man called Richard Smith. And when I was talking with Richard the other day, he says there are now somewhere in excess of 35,000 Scottish limited partnerships that we know absolutely nothing about. Sometimes investigative journalists find examples. And this is the type of thing that David Leask, that I mentioned, has done such a marvelous job writing about some of the examples that have been found by investigative journalists. This in itself tells you something about the system. We have only become aware of some of the worst behaviours in society because of investigative journalists, not because we have any effective system in the UK for controlling and overseeing and preventing corruption. That in itself tells a story.
Now, let me deal with the two aspects of what you've just raised. First of all, the idea of the secretive nature of SLPs, so-called Scottish partnerships, but the Scottish Government doesn't have any legal authority to investigate them. But they're set up in Companies House because they're kind of like partnerships. Now, if a dentist or a doctor's practice sets up a partnership, it's an individual business, isn't it? They have unlimited liability. But SLPs are kind of halfway in between partnerships and companies, aren't they? Because they do have to
Yes,
register.
they are a peculiar arrangement. They are so peculiar and became so favoured of the type of people that I've been describing after 2008 that when I was an MP between 2015 and 17, I tried to run a campaign to get the UK government to tighten up in the regulations. And I sat on what was called then the Regulatory Reform Select Committee. And on the same day as I was trying to force the government to open up a consultation into SLPs, right, through other devices, the UK government, at the request of financiers in the City of London, were creating other forms of limited partnerships that were near identical to the form that SLPs take. In other words, allowing some of the large financial players in London to play the same game as the oligarchs in different parts of the world. So,
Yep. So
the problem is at the moment, how do we get the UK government to act given Scotland doesn't have the powers? That's why I'm quite pessimistic. I think we need to get a focus in Scotland on what our policies are going to be to manage the situation once we become independent. But I see little evidence at the moment that the UK government are likely to do anything about these forms of abuses.
Yet I haven't heard of the UK government showing any interest in it. And as you say, Roger, it has been raised for several years now, and including by the BBC. Now, one thing that struck me when I was reading your paper was I was reminded of a program I heard on BBC Radio 4 about 3 weeks ago. And I think it was in Year and Years of one of the consumer programs. I don't know if you've heard of this situation about people suddenly finding that they've been registered without their will, without their knowledge, as a company director. And the program said that in one street in a town in England, everybody in that street had become a company director because somebody, we don't know who, had registered the company in Companies House and put their name and address and postcode on it, and then opened bank accounts. And then when those bank accounts got overdrawn or went into default, or when credit cards have been spent drawn on those bank accounts, the bills started arriving at these people's addresses, and they couldn't do anything about it. They have to then go to the court and hire a lawyer and have it proved that they did not start the company, which itself, of course, is bizarre. The victim has to pay. But the point I'm going to get at is that the Companies House washes its hands of it. It's just not their responsibility. It's bizarre that the Companies House has no authority to investigate the people who are setting up these companies. They just do nothing. So surely that's one thing Scotland should be doing if Scotland had the power. Surely
Have you
Scotland
the
would say,
power?
yes, if you want to start a company, you have
Yes.
to at least say who you are.
If I if I, if I try to respond to you, Hugh, if I remember, I've got two main points to make. The first is, if we think about this in terms of what we have been discussing in terms of Scottish limited partnerships, are we give an example in the paper of one SLP registered with companies called been involved in the past, as a story from David Least revealed, in skimming off about £1.5 million from an arms sale involving Ukraine. Right? It took the Ukrainian authorities in 2017 to make a complaint about that SLP before it came to light. Right? The UK government were informed about it. The UK government did nothing. You can go on to Companies House, as I did this morning, and check. It is still there, and it is still registered by Companies House. One of the peculiar things that has happened, however, is after the David Least story in early 2017, a few months later, the one filing that this SLP has made in its 10 years or so of existence has been to change its address. It changed its address from Edinburgh to what is a small shop front at 44 Main Street, Douglas, in the south of Lanarkshire. Now, they registered that address without any knowledge at all of whoever owns that wee shop, Lanarkshire. But they're not the only one. There are thousands of SLPs registered at exactly that same address. Companies House have been informed about this, what I would say surely must be illegal use of someone else's addresses. And it's not just that they're turning a blind eye, they have refused to do anything about it. So what we have got is we have got people able to use whatever address they wish. My second example is not about SLPs, it's about things called mini umbrella companies. And these have been used, particularly in England during the pandemic, to take lots and lots of public money through the tax system and all the rest of it and abuse it through England's test and trace system. Fortunately, the way in which we ran things in Scotland meant that that did not happen here. However, these types of companies, we have found, are now beginning to infiltrate into Scotland. So that I'm sitting in Kirkcaldy, and there is one address in Kirkcaldy where there's more than 200 mini umbrella companies registered. These are companies, not partnerships. But what they do is set themselves up, and they have only got one name. Fortunately, that one named director is a Filipino based in the Philippines. They then, because of the way in which Companies House operates, they don't need to make any financial filings for about a year and a half, would be the norm. Right? So they're able to operate as a legitimate, an apparently legitimate company for up to nearly a year and a half. And then what do they do? Well, rather than making their financial returns as they're required to Companies House, they dissolve themselves as a company. And then you find they're replaced by yet another company that will then go on to dissolve itself and remove itself from a Companies House as an active company. And they're being used, we know in England, for huge amounts of crime. However, we don't know exactly why they're registering now in Scotland and what they're doing. So that if you then want to find that out, the problem is in the UK, we don't have any overarching corruption authority to try and prevent corruption. We have only got the police largely, or regulators, if they find a crime has taken place. So that although there are hundreds and hundreds of these dubious companies in Scotland, nobody is investigating them because nobody has the powers to do so. And so that's another example of another type of operation that is really harming the marketplace. And it's deeply concerning to anybody who would want to see Scotland to have an efficient economic system and an efficient marketplace where honest businesses and honest individuals are treated fairly.
So, two things that Scotland could do if Scotland were an independent country is, first of all, Scotland could establish a proper registration system, a kind of a Scottish Companies House.
Absolutely.
That what we should, I said earlier on, you should at least identify yourself as show who you are. Do you think there's any other basic steps that should be taken should such an organisation have the power to disband a company if it behaved illegally, for example?
Well, I think for what you require at Companies House, you require enough people to oversee the registrations. When I was an MP, I asked the question, how many registered businesses of all types are there in Companies House? To which the answer at that time was somewhere over 4 million registered. And I asked the written question, which was effectively asking, how many people have Companies House got that's devoted just to overseeing that these registrations are legitimate? To which the answer was, in full-time equivalent people, 6. So 6 people were responsible for millions of registrations. And given the complexity of registrations, the thought that that means there's any effective oversight at all is, of course, a nonsense. So there's no effective scrutiny of registrations for many types of business formations. And that's part of the problem. So most businesses in Scotland, Scottish businesses that are registered, operate perfectly legally, operate perfectly ethically, make all the returns appropriately, use legitimate addresses and all the rest of it. Right? Excellent. The problem is there are people in the marketplace who don't want to operate honestly and fairly. And it's these people that don't want to operate honestly and fairly that are getting away with absolute blue murder in the UK at present.
Right. So on the one hand, Companies House doesn't have the staff, even if it had the will. I'm not sure if they have the legal authority to investigate a company, but even if they had, they haven't got the people to do it anyway. But the other thing is, would a future Scottish government regulate businesses in a different way? For example, should there be a limit to how many businesses one individual could set up? Or do you think that would be unreasonable? But if somebody set up 3 businesses this year and closed them down, do you think that should be it?
Oh, well, I wouldn't have an answer to that interesting question you just posed me off the top of my head, Hugh. What I would say is it's going to be very important that Scotland thinks through before we become independent exactly how it's going to regulate registrations. We cannot possibly use the same model as Companies House. It is failing abysmally. And so we need to, that's why we are raising some of these issues now. We hope it will create a debate what should be done. I'm not pretending I'm the soul of all wisdom to know exactly what the best way of doing this is. What I think is we do know enough about the abuse of the system to know that we should be thinking seriously about this. And we should be preparing to make sure that once Scotland becomes independent, she is much better prepared to ensure that things operate honestly and fairly in everyone's benefit.
Yes, it's perfectly feasible for the government to set up a commission by the Law Society of Scotland, for example, to look at an area of law and to make recommendations that the government might want to legislate on. That's happened, for example, when Helena Kennedy, I think, was asked to look into the misogyny investigation. So it's quite possible for the government to take a bit more time than it gave you the problem and decide what kind of measures to put forward. I'll
Yeah,
just
I
move
mean,
on anyway, Rob. That
sorry.
wasn't really a question. I've just
No,
put
I
in my
recognise it wasn't the question. But anyway, you carry on, you.
I was going to move on to the question of investigative journalism and how important that is, because you did say in your report actually that it, it, one of the abuses of power that the dodgy businesses can make and often have made is to use the law against journalists to stop those pesky journalists from sticking their nose in. And in fact, you mentioned slaps. Now, slaps is a thing which I read about a few weeks ago. in Andrew McKell's column in the Sunday National, Andrew Tickell, sorry, who's a law lecturer at Glasgow
Mhm.
Caledonian University. There is legal change happening there in Scotland. But what are SLAPs, first of all? Could you remind me? I've made a note of it.
All right. Well, SLAPS is a terrible acronym. They stand for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. That's a SLAP. What does that mean? Eh, it means basically that people like oligarchs who get huge amounts of money, and if they find an investigative journalist is undertaking activity going to expose them for some of their nefarious activities, what they can then do, I mean, much of the law is actually at the moment on their side. So they can hire an army of QCs and investigators and all the rest of it, and then threaten journalists, threaten newspapers with prosecution. Now, I don't know of any journalist at all in Scotland. I don't know of any newspapers at all in Scotland, for example, that could possibly afford to mount a defence against some of these characters. And therefore, what happens? Well, what happens is stories are buried. Important stories in the public interest are buried because of threats from people who don't want their matters to be revealed in public. Now, in my view, this is against the public interest. Now, of course, there needs to be a balance of the law here. You know, you don't want to prevent people from being able to take legal action if they are being defamed by others. However, there needs to be a protection of the public interest of proper scrutiny by investigative journalists. And the point I made earlier, I would repeat in this context. If we don't have investigative journalists exposing some of these activities, nobody else is going to do it at present. They're a fundamentally important part of the way in which we have these matters in the public eye and can begin to think about how best we address them. So I think there is scope for, I'm not a lawyer, but I certainly think there is scope for reform of the law and to make sure there are proper rights against what is, to secure what is in the public interest.
Well, the example I gave of Andrew Tukell's column actually illustrates what I was saying earlier on, that looking at the abuse of libel law, the Scottish libel law, is being changed. It's not in a major way, but I think the main change is that previously a journalist could have had to wait for 2 years to know whether they were going to be taken to the cleaners or not, and that means in those 2 years they'd be frightened to say anything about that company. But that term is being shortened. I think it's to something like 6 months. So that maybe a minor change, but
Yeah,
at least the law is
yeah,
recognising
yes.
that.
I mean, I've not read Andrew's piece, so, but if that were the only change, it is, to all intents and purposes, pretty meaningless. There needs to be
Again, I
something
can't.
more. There needs to be something pretty robust to protect the public interest here. And that's what, in the view of myself and many others, research into the field of corruption, that's what we think is missing at the moment. There isn't proper protection of the public interest.
Yeah, so it's about balance. As you say, people who are liable have a right to use law, but it's out of balance. That's what you're saying, really. Now, let's look at another one of the many fascinating topics you've raised in this paper today. Now, I'm going to go back to the question of the COVID contracts, because you've said earlier on that corruption isn't one thing. It could be just paying, bribing officials, but it also could mean public contracts not going through the proper procedures. Now, there's two sides to this. There's the setting up of emergency companies to deal with an emergency. Maybe that's feasible. Maybe that's a good excuse. Where we've got to get this stuff out quickly in the case of the protection equipment for COVID. And the other side of it is the usual procedure that companies bid out in the open, and the best company gets a contract. So those. The other thing, of course, is that nepotism, as you said earlier on, it's only in very corrupt governments where contracts, valuable contracts being paid by the taxpayer ultimately, are given to friends of the government. Surely that doesn't happen in the UK, does it?
Well, it absolutely does happen in the UK. Transparency International pointed out that there were a considerable number of multi-million pounds contracts given out by the UK government, excuse me, at the early stage of the pandemic, and by some surprise, they only went to supporters of the Conservative Party. And so the notion that it doesn't happen in the UK, I couldn't agree with. I mean, I actually think Scotland has done remarkably well to hold back that wave of what I would call corruption that has undoubtedly happened in England. And I would say a lot of credit there goes to the sterling work of Ivan McKee, the minister who was, as far as I understand, partly responsible for searching out people who are going to supply the necessary goods and services to ensure that Scotland's test and trace system, for example, operated appropriately. But what has happened in England, as Transparency International has pointed out, is huge abuse. You were getting companies that were set up that were less than 6 weeks old, that had obviously made no financial filings whatsoever, had no track record, getting contracts in the hundreds of millions of pounds. How on earth could that possibly be a proper way to manage anything? Regardless of whether it is an emergency or not, we have got many companies that could quite sensibly have been bidding for contracts and not having them handed out in the way that they were. I mean, it's not just that, but many of these companies that were set up and were less than 6 weeks old that got contracts didn't have to bid for them. There was no bidding process. They were awarded them by the executive action of ministers, for example. So this raises all sorts of profound questions. And I think it's not too strong a word to say that it is indicative of corruption in the system.
And we're talking about large numbers too, because we're talking about several contracts of tens of millions or even hundreds of millions. And of course, the English track and trace system, which in contrast to the Scottish one, which was run by the health service, the English track and trace system was given. Well, people often quote this figure of 37 billion. That's the figure that's always bandied about. Is that accurate as far as I know? The 37 billion.
Well, I mean, it's I'm not an accountant, so I've not gone into the contracts and counted up all the pennies. But it certainly is. I mean, you're right to say this is the type of figure that people are making the assumption has been involved. I mean, it's multi-billion pounds. But just look at the lack of attention to this. In Westminster, there's very little concern about these matters being shown, certainly by the Tories.
So now you raised the question of international comparisons a couple of minutes ago, because you talked about the organisation Transparency International, and they do an attempt. I don't know what method they use. They do an attempt to measure corruption, and if you're at the top of their anti-corruption list, it's constructed that way. So the small countries usually at the top are the least corrupt. I haven't looked down, sorry, to see where Britain appears. But how does Britain compare internationally on that, and in both in terms of where they are on the list, and also in terms of the lax regulation which you've talked about earlier?
Yeah. I mean, Britain doesn't compare all that badly. Now, they're not in the top league. They're not as good as the small advanced countries. But that's why I said earlier in this interview, Hugh, the paper does not say that Britain is amongst the worst. But what we are saying, the problems that they have got are huge in nature. And because we're not the worst, doesn't mean we shouldn't be attending to these matters. And so what we would like to see is Scotland aspiring to be amongst the best, not being satisfied with where we may be at present because of our attachment to the UK. So, but we look not just at Transparency International, because they use only one methodology. We look also at research that's been undertaken by the EU, some large-scale research as well. And it confirms, I think we quote the figure that when they polled more than 1,000 people in the UK, right, I think it was around 50% of people thought that there was corruption going on in the UK. And that is deeply worrying. Now, it wasn't nearly as bad as Greece, but it was nowhere near as good as Finland. And what we're saying is Scotland should be aspire to be as effective in dealing with corruption as your Norways, your Finlands, your New Zealands of this world. Why should we not aspire to root out some of the worst excesses of corruption?
Now, let me just give one other example of corrupt. You clearly think that peerages to the House of Lords is an example of corrupt behaviour, and your paper quotes many people who have donated to the Conservative Party and then find themselves in the House of Lords. Is that one very easy thing that Scotland could do as an independent country, not have a House of Lords?
Well, absolutely. I mean, as you will know, Hugh, the SNP have had for many, many years a policy of not putting anyone forward, the names forward, to sit in the House of Lords. So that, for example, when you look at all the lists of party donors that have been ennobled in recent years, you will find zero under the headline SNP, for which I am enormously grateful. But you will find in recent times 22 major donors of the Conservative Party have got seats in the House of Lords, 5 major donors of the Liberal Democrats, 2 major donors of the Labour Party are all sitting in the House of Lords. And it would appear they're sitting in the House of Lords merely because they donated a lot of money to these respective parties. Is that a basis upon which we want a second chamber to be there to provide scrutiny over laws? Absolutely not. I mean, it's not merely that it's undemocratic, it is also that it is fundamentally corrupt, that people can buy places. I think the latest that the Daily Telegraph and others have found is that their suspicion is that it costs about £3 million a donation to the Tory party to almost guarantee yourself the prospect of a seat in the House of Lords.
Well,
So
one
much for the
thing that's
Tory party being the party of law and order.
Exactly. Well, I was going to move on to the international context, and you talk about Russian money. Of course, famously, there's been a son of a KGB agent, has been elevated to the House of Lords recently. Now, you also talk in the paper
I
about
Boris Johnson.
golden visa. Sorry, I missed you.
It was Boris Johnson that
Aye.
went against the advice of the MI5 to put the Russian in the House of Lords.
Medvedev, yes. So what you're saying about Russian money is that it was connected to golden visas, wasn't it? Which meant after the banking crisis of 2008, the then government, which was a Labour government, basically said, if you've got loads of money, you can become a UK citizen. So, but there's also, you cite in the paper, a huge amount of Russian money, and you believe that has political influence. So Russian oligarchs using Gordon Brown's golden visa scheme have been able to flood into London, take over the property market and take over the political market. Is this part of the state capture you're talking about?
Yeah, that's part of the state capture. And of course, what we've already done this evening, Hugh, in this discussion, is we've pointed out that there are all these different things that for many people appear to be unconnected. Right? So you've got peculiar people becoming members of the House of Lords. You've got a scandal about a prime minister trying to rewrite some of the rules of parliament. You have got bribery going on. You have got things like Scottish limited partnerships and many umbrella companies littering the scene, etc., etc. And what we're basically saying is you've got to see this in the round. This is part of an overall picture about the culture that is developing in the UK that is making it easier and easier to describe it as one that's open to state capture. Right? If, for example, all you need to do to get a place in the House of Lords and influence legislation is to write a big cheque, if that's not corruption, I don't know what is.
Yeah, of course, the future Scotland could have a second house, could have a senate if we so decide. But of course, it would be elected, so that that takes it out of the corruption thing. If a seat cannot be given in return for money, if it's elected, then that wouldn't
Yeah,
be part of the corrupt nexus, would it?
absolutely. I think, although we could argue about the fine detail, I think everything has to be rigorously democratic in nature in an independent Scotland in terms of the politics and the development of policy. And that in itself becomes fundamentally your biggest safeguard against malign influences.
Have democracy, of course, democratic selection of officials, openness, and the ability of investigative journalists to look into abuses, of course. That's how to keep on top of it. But just finally, before we move on from this fascinating topic, the big question really in your paper is what harm does it do us? Is this a victimless crime? So a few dodgy guys make some money and they're able to buy a luxury yacht in Cannes, but is it actually hurting ordinary Scottish citizens?
Yes, I would encourage people to look at the paper because we give lots of examples of the way in which the ordinary citizen is paying the price for this. They're paying the price in all sorts of different ways. Communities are paying the price. Who funds drug barons in some of our communities? Right? Well, it's precisely the type of people that might want to use Scottish limited partnerships to hide their money. Right? What about the elderly people in our community? And there are huge numbers in our community who have been subjected to online fraud, taking away all their savings. Very often these criminal activities are aided and abetted by the system we've got in the UK. It's far too easy for them to operate, and it's far too difficult for us to get at. So individuals of all sorts, and particularly vulnerable individuals, are the people who are predominantly paying the price. And that's why this needs to be much further up the political agenda.
So corruption is not a victimless crime, and as you pointed out in the paper, you've argued tonight, and you've also given further detail in the paper, it tends to corrupt the political system in the ways you've described, but it does hurt us economically. Money, as I said earlier on, is taken out of the
Yep.
economy that should be in circulation. Also, it drives, makes it more difficult for honest companies to operate if the dishonest get the contract ahead of them. And also, you argue in the paper, it actually materially slows down economic growth. So corruption is far
Absolutely.
from a crime, and far more political attention should be paid to it. But finally, would you agree that there are steps that could be taken if some of those lax regulations and some of those underfunded regulatory bodies were given the legal power and the staff to do the job? It could be tackled.
Undoubtedly. We give half a dozen examples of things that might be undertaken in Scotland. There are many things that could be done. And what we would argue is that the many things that could be done are relatively inexpensive. What they really require is the political will to want to change the system.
Actually, not only might it be unexpected, it might actually be a money earner too. I'm thinking
Oh,
of
absolutely. All the evidence says that if you improve some of these things, the economy actually grows faster.
yep.
And so that it more than pays for itself.
Well, I'll just wind that fascinating discussion up, Roger, by reiterating, as you said, that people really ought to have a look at the paper. But I warn you, you will be angry, and when you get to the end of it, you'll want to take action. You'll be demanding that something should be done. So go and read it. So the bottom line paper out today on corruption, the economic and political costs is on the bottomline.scot, and the other three papers that I've discussed previously with Roger on there. Can we expect more papers then during the coming months, Roger?
Yes, we've got about another 8 on the stocks being prepared as we speak.
Right, so thanks once again for being on the programme, and thank you and your team for the industrious work you're putting in to researching how could Scotland be better, or how does Scotland suffer from not being an independent country. So the Bottom Line Group, reinvigorating the debate into Scottish independence. And so thank you very much, Roger, for coming on the show again tonight. I found that fascinating, both reading the paper and discussing the implications with you. So thanks, and I hope we'll see you again on Broadcasting Scotland.
Thank you.
So thanks to Roger. So before I go this evening, thank you for watching. Now, can I just remind you that we at Broadcasting Scotland always put out our programmes free to view, and we will continue with that. But of course, we running the television station is not free. We obviously have bills to pay. Now, we are on a drive to recruit more supporters. If you can manage £5 a month, we'd urge you to become one of our supporters. If you look on our own website, which is on the screen below me just now. If you can manage £5 a month, please sign up, start a direct debit, and we want to recruit more supporters. So if you like this sort of discussions we're having in broadcasting in Scotland, then please tell a friend, try and get somebody else to become one of our regular viewers and supporters. If we had 10,000 subscribers, we would be employing staff and going out every evening, doing something about 10 or 12 hours television and doing more programs. That's what we need to do. And please give us a hand to do that. But anyway, thank you for watching tonight, and we'll have a special program tomorrow with a new presenter, so please tune into Scotland at 7. And this is Hugh Stewart and Roger Mullin. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.